Squirrel species around the world. 70 types of squirrel. Eastern gray squirrel. Western gray squirrel. Red squirrel. Fox squirrel. Southern Amazon red squirrel. Japanese squirrel. Mexican gray squirrel. Brazilian squirrel. Finlayson squirrel. Northern Amazon red squirrel. Persian squirrel. Guayaquil squirrel. Abert squirrel. Japanese dwarf flying squirrel. Eurasian red squirrel. Plantain squirrel. Neotropical pygmy squirrel. Variegated squirrel. 𝗦𝗾𝗂𝗏𝗶𝗶𝗹 squirrel. Central American dwarf squirrel. Richardson's ground squirrel. Cape ground squirrel. California ground squirrel. Arctic ground squirrel. Belding's ground squirrel. Rock squirrel. Colombian ground squirrel. Golden mantled ground squirrel. Spotted ground squirrel. Round-tailed ground squirrel. Harris's antelope squirrel. Barbary ground squirrel. Mojave ground squirrel. Franklin's ground squirrel. Wyoming ground squirrel. European ground squirrel. �13-lined ground squirrel. Gunnison's prairie dog. Mexican ground squirrel. Black-tailed prairie dog. Southern flying squirrel. Northern flying squirrel. Siberian flying squirrel. Red giant flying squirrel. 𝗦𝗾𝗂𝗏𝗃 giant flying squirrel. Japanese giant flying squirrel. Chinese giant flying squirrel. Spotted giant flying squirrel. Indian giant flying squirrel. Kashmir flying squirrel. Malayan flying squirrel. Red-cheeked flying squirrel. Small Kashmir flying squirrel. Sunda flying squirrel. Formosan flying squirrel. Javanese flying squirrel. Large brown flying squirrel. African pygmy squirrel. Prevost squirrel. Bornean black-banded squirrel. Horse-tailed squirrel. Indian palm squirrel. Eastern fox squirrel. Andean squirrel. Sri Lankan giant squirrel. Western dwarf squirrel. Incan squirrel. Gray-bellied squirrel. Smith's bush squirrel. African striped ground squirrel.